This is HOA consequences. Let me set the scene in one breath. You just earned yourself a reinspection. That is what Kathleen Brown shouted at me the second I stepped out of my car, before I even touched the fence materials stacked on my driveway. She stood in the middle of my front yard with her phone held out like a weapon, her gray baseball cap pulled low, her blue light jacket zipped all the way up even though it was 60 degrees. Behind her, a roll of caution tape stretched across my yard between two survey stakes, flapping in the breeze like crime scene decoration. I work as a community college instructor, which means I cannot afford complaints that spiral into formal hearings or legal fees. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, in a development called Stonehaven, where the Stonehaven Fence Compliance Association micromanages fence styles like it is fine art. Kathleen is the HOA vice president, and she had just declared war over materials I had not even unloaded yet. I set the pickets down on the driveway and looked at her. "What are you talking about, Kathleen? I submitted the fence application 2 months ago. I got approval in writing." She shook her head hard enough that her shoulder-length dark brown hair whipped across her face. "That approval was conditional. You were supposed to submit updated material samples before delivery. You did not. So now you are in violation before you even start." I blinked. No one told me that. She smiled, sharp and mean. "I am telling you now. You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." She said it like a catchphrase she had been waiting to deploy, and I felt my stomach drop. A maintenance worker in a reflective vest stood by the street corner, watching the whole thing silently, his arms crossed. I pulled out my phone and opened the approval email. It says right here that the fence design and materials are approved as submitted. Show me where it says I need to resubmit samples. She did not even look at my screen. I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes. That was the moment I knew this was going to get worse. She turned and walked toward the caution tape, and I followed her, my red bucket hat sliding forward as I moved. The tape was stretched tight across the yard, blocking access to the back gate. "I have a permit inspection scheduled for this afternoon, Kathleen. If I miss it, the job gets delayed and I lose money." She shrugged. Should have followed the process. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. The contractor truck pulled up 10 minutes later, and Kathleen immediately stepped into the driveway like a traffic cop. She held up her phone and started recording. "This is commercial activity. You cannot have contractor vehicles parked on site for more than 30 minutes without a temporary parking variance. I am calling the tow company." The driver, a guy named Rick who had worked with me on 2 other projects, leaned out the window. "Lady, I am here to unload materials. That is not commercial activity. That is delivery." She shook her head. The HOA defines commercial activity as any vehicle with signage or equipment used for profit-making work. You have both. Rick looked at me, and I waved him to stay put. I pulled up the parking variance I had filed 3 weeks ago and showed it to Kathleen. She glanced at it and sneered. "That variance was for last week. It expired. You need a new one for today." I checked the date. The variance was valid through the end of the month. I pointed that out. She ignored me and dialed a number on her phone. Rick got out of the truck and started unloading fence panels anyway. Kathleen shouted at him to stop. He did not. She shouted louder. He kept working. She called someone, said she needed enforcement on site immediately, and hung up. Then she walked over to one of the fence panels Rick had leaned against the truck and kicked it. Not hard, just enough to make it slide and clatter. Rick froze. "You just damaged my property," I said. She smiled. Prove it. The maintenance worker was still watching from the corner, and I made eye contact with him. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was filing this away. I did not know it yet, but he would become an ally later. Kathleen pulled a laminated policy sheet out of her jacket pocket and held it out between us like a shield. This is the emergency stop work enforcement protocol. It allows me to halt any construction activity if I determine there is a risk of non-compliance. I am invoking it right now. You have 10 minutes to remove all materials from the property, or I will cite you for obstruction. I stared at her. You cannot do that. The permit is active. She tapped the laminated sheet. The permit is conditional on HOA pre-approval of each phase. You skipped the material verification phase. That voids the permit. I pulled out my phone again and called the management company. No answer. I left a message. Kathleen watched me with her arms crossed, her expression smug. When I hung up, she said, "You are wasting your time. Management sends contradictory instructions like a trap. They told you one thing, they told me another. Guess who they listen to when it matters?" Rick finished unloading and drove off before Kathleen could call the tow truck. She immediately shifted tactics. She walked around the stack of fence panels, taking photos from every angle, narrating into her phone like she was documenting a crime scene. Panel height exceeds allowable variance by 0.4 inches. Color tone is off spec. Grain pattern does not match approved sample. I followed her, filming her with my phone. She noticed and stopped. "You are not allowed to record me without consent." I laughed. "You have been recording me for the last 20 minutes, Kathleen." She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. "That is different. I am acting in my official capacity as HOA Vice President. You are just a homeowner." I could smell her perfume, floral and sharp. I took a step back. "I am also a homeowner with a permit and a deadline. If you block this project, I am going to file a formal complaint." She leaned in. "Go ahead. I have handled 43 complaints this year. I have never lost." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and started building a case. I pulled every email, every approval document, every receipt, every inspection report. I had a home-based business license for freelance curriculum design work, and the HOA had been trying to get it revoked for 6 months by claiming my occasional client meetings constituted commercial use of residential property. Kathleen had filed 3 separate complaints with the city zoning board, and all 3 had been dismissed. Now she was targeting my fence as retaliation. I knew it. I could prove it. I just needed the right evidence. I started screenshotting the HOA group chat, where Kathleen and 2 board members had coordinated a targeted enforcement wave against me. One message said, "We need to make an example." Another said, "Revoke the business license and the fence permit at the same time." Maximum pressure. I saved everything. I kept my phone in my pocket, because I was saving one clip for the finale. The next morning, Kathleen showed up at my door at 7:30 with a tape measure and a clipboard. She did not knock. She rang the doorbell 6 times in a row. When I opened the door, she held up the clipboard. "I am here to conduct a surprise fence measuring stunt. I need to verify setback compliance before the inspector arrives." I rubbed my eyes. "The inspector is not coming until 3. You do not need to be here." She pushed past me and walked around the side of the house. I followed her in my pajamas, my red bucket hat shoved on backward. She stopped at the property line and pulled the tape measure out, snapping it open with a loud crack. She measured from the fence post to the edge of the property, then frowned. "This is off." I looked at the tape. "It is 1 inch inside the setback line, Kathleen." "That is compliant." She shook her head. "The setback is measured from the outer edge of the post, not the face of the panel. You are in violation." I pulled out my copy of the HOA fence guidelines. "It says right here that setback is measured from the face of the panel." She grabbed the paper out of my hand and ripped it in half. "Old version. We updated the rules last month." I stared at the torn paper in her hand. "You cannot just change the rules in the middle of a project." She smiled. "Watch me." I called Rick and asked him to come back with his own tape measure and a camera. He showed up an hour later with a laser level and a digital measuring tool. Kathleen was still in my yard, now sitting on a lawn chair she had brought from somewhere, sipping coffee like she was on a stakeout. Rick ignored her and set up the laser level. He measured the setback 3 times, from 3 different angles, and every measurement came back the same. Compliant. He took photos and timestamped them. Kathleen stood up and walked over. "That equipment is not certified by the HOA. Your measurements are invalid." Rick laughed. "Lady, this is a commercial-grade laser level used by licensed surveyors. It does not need HOA certification." She grabbed her phone and started recording him. "I am documenting your refusal to cooperate with HOA enforcement." Rick shook his head and packed up his gear. "Call me when she leaves," he said, and drove off. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories. Kathleen escalated again that afternoon. She called an emergency board meeting and pushed through a resolution to ban me from all community amenities until my fence was removed and replaced with an approved design. The resolution passed 3-2, with Kathleen casting the deciding vote. I got the notification by email at 2:15, 45 minutes before the permit inspector was supposed to arrive. The email included a list of banned amenities: the pool, the clubhouse, the walking trails, the mailroom, and the guest parking lot. It also included a threat to place a lien on my property if I did not comply within 14 days. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, a guy named Tom, who specialized in HOA disputes. He called me back in 10 minutes. "This is retaliation," he said. "They cannot ban you from amenities for a fence dispute. We can fight this." I told him about the group chat screenshots. He said, "Send them to me now." I did. The permit inspector arrived at 3 and immediately noticed the caution tape. He looked at me. "What is this about?" I explained the situation. He frowned and walked the property line, checking measurements and comparing them to the permit drawings. Everything looked fine. He took photos and made notes. Then Kathleen appeared, walking across my yard like she owned it. She introduced herself as the HOA vice president and handed the inspector a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a broken survey stake. She said, "This was removed from the property line without authorization. That is tampering with a legal boundary marker." The inspector looked at the stake, then at me. "Did you remove this?" I shook my head. I did not touch any survey stakes. Kathleen smiled. "Then who did?" The inspector put the bag down and said, "This is between you and the HOA. My job is to verify permit compliance. Your fence meets the code requirements. I am signing off." He filled out the inspection report and left. Kathleen stared at me, her face red. This is not over. That night, Tom called me back with news. He had reviewed the group chat screenshots and the HOA bylaws, and he found something. Kathleen is not authorized to issue enforcement letters. Only the HOA president can do that, and only after a formal board vote. Every letter she sent you is invalid. I felt a surge of hope. Can we use that? Tom said, absolutely. I am drafting a cease and desist letter right now. It will demand that the HOA withdraw all enforcement actions, issue a formal apology, and refund any fees you have paid. If they do not comply, we file a lawsuit. I hung up and sat back in my chair. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. The next morning, Kathleen showed up again, this time with a string line and 2 metal stakes. She hammered the stakes into the ground on either side of my fence line and stretched the string tight. Then she pulled out her tape measure and started checking the alignment. I watched from the window. Rick pulled up a few minutes later and walked over to see what she was doing. She told him to leave. He refused. She threatened to call the police. He laughed and pulled out his phone. Go ahead. I will show them the photos from yesterday. She hesitated, then went back to her string line. Rick set up his own string line parallel to hers, about 6 inches away. Then he measured the distance between the 2 lines and called out the numbers. Kathleen tried to argue, but the numbers did not lie. Her line was crooked. His was straight. She packed up her gear and stormed off. 2 days later, Tom sent the cease and desist letter. The HOA attorney received it on a Friday afternoon and responded on Monday morning with a 1-line email. We are withdrawing all enforcement actions effective immediately. No apology, no refund offer, just a withdrawal. Tom called me and said, that is a good start, but it is not enough. We are going to push for the refund and the apology. In the meantime, finish your fence. Do not give them any new openings. I called Rick and scheduled the install for Wednesday. Kathleen did not show up that day. Neither did anyone else from the HOA. The install went smoothly. The fence looked great. I took photos and sent them to Tom. The following week, the HOA scheduled a general membership meeting. I showed up with Tom and a folder full of evidence. The meeting room was packed. Kathleen sat at the head table with the other board members, her expression smug. When it was time for homeowner comments, I stood up and walked to the microphone. I started by reading the group chat messages out loud. We need to make an example. Revoke the business license and the fence permit at the same time. Maximum pressure. The room went silent. Kathleen tried to interrupt, but the HOA president told her to sit down. I continued. I have photos, timestamps, and witness statements proving that Kathleen Brown harassed me, damaged my property, and issued enforcement letters without authorization. I also have proof that she lied about rule changes and misrepresented HOA policy to a city inspector. I held up the plastic evidence bag with the broken survey stake. This stake was not removed by me. It was removed by a contractor working on a gas line 2 months ago, before I even applied for my fence permit. I have the work order to prove it. The contractor is here tonight. I pointed to the maintenance worker in the reflective vest, sitting in the back row. He stood up and nodded. Kathleen's face went pale. Tom stood up next and addressed the board. My client has been subjected to targeted harassment and retaliation by your vice president. The evidence is overwhelming. Unless this board takes immediate corrective action, we will file a lawsuit for defamation, harassment, and abuse of authority. The HOA attorney will be named as a co-defendant for enabling this behavior. The room erupted. Homeowners started shouting questions. The HOA president called for order. Kathleen tried to speak, but no one would listen. The president asked Tom what corrective action he wanted. Tom said, "First, a formal apology and a full refund of all fees my client has paid related to this fence dispute. Second, a vote to remove Kathleen Brown from her position as vice president. Third, an independent audit of the HOA compliance process to prevent this from happening to anyone else." The president looked at the other board members. They nodded. The motion passed unanimously, with Kathleen abstaining. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked out. The room stayed silent until the door closed behind her. 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail for $940, covering every fee and fine I had paid during the dispute. The check came with a letter signed by the new HOA vice president, apologizing for the harassment and confirming that my fence was fully compliant. The letter also mentioned that the HOA compliance process was being audited and cleaned up. I called Tom and thanked him. He said, "You did most of the work. You kept the receipts. That is what won this." I asked about Kathleen. He said, "She resigned from the board entirely. Word is, she is moving out of the neighborhood next month." I hung up and walked outside to look at my fence. It was perfect. Straight, level, and exactly where it was supposed to be. A month later, I got a call from the maintenance worker, the one who had watched the whole thing unfold. His name was Marcus. He said, "I testified at the audit hearing last week. They asked me what I saw, and I told them everything. Kathleen tried to say I was lying, but I had my own photos and notes from the day she kicked your fence panel. The auditors ruled her complaint unfounded with evidence cited. She tried to appeal, but the board shut it down." I thanked him. He said, "No problem. I have seen her pull this kind of thing before. Somebody needed to stop her." We ended the call, and I sat down at my kitchen table with a beer. I pulled out my phone and opened the video I had been saving. It was from the day Kathleen showed up with the tape measure. In the clip, she clearly says the setback is measured from the face of the panel before she realizes she is being recorded and changes her story. I had not needed to use it at the meeting, but I had kept it just in case. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. That clip, combined with a documented log of repeated gate access failures tied to Karen's admin account, was the proof I handed the officer on scene when Kathleen tried one last time to get my contractor truck towed. I asked for an incident number immediately, and the officer wrote up a report on the spot. Kathleen never tried again after that. The final showdown happened a week later, when a surveyor truck parked by the boundary to verify the property line for the county records update. The surveyor got out with his equipment and started setting up. Kathleen appeared out of nowhere, walking across the yard like she still had authority. She demanded to see his credentials. He ignored her and kept working. She tried to order him off the property. He pulled out his county work order and told her to call the sheriff if she had a problem. She did. The sheriff showed up 20 minutes later, and Kathleen immediately tried to explain that I was violating multiple HOA rules and the surveyor was enabling me. The sheriff listened for about 30 seconds, then cut her off. "Ma'am, this is a county-authorized survey. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. If you interfere with county work, I will cite you for obstruction." Kathleen stared at him, her mouth open. The surveyor finished his work, packed up, and left. The sheriff followed. Kathleen stood in my yard for another 5 minutes, then walked away without saying a word. The surveyor's report confirmed what I already knew. My fence was exactly where it was supposed to be. The setback was compliant. The height was compliant. The materials were compliant. Everything Kathleen had claimed was either false or based on rules she had invented. I sent a copy of the report to Tom, who forwarded it to the HOA attorney. The attorney responded with a terse email confirming that all enforcement actions were permanently withdrawn and that my file was closed. Tom sent one more letter, a lawyer letter that forced a retraction and a refund. The HOA sent a formal notice to all homeowners, stating that Kathleen Brown was no longer affiliated with the board, and that any prior enforcement actions issued by her were void. The notice also announced that the compliance process had been overhauled, and that all future enforcement actions would require a full board vote and documented evidence. I ran into Kathleen one last time, at the grocery store 2 months later. She saw me in the cereal aisle and turned around. I did not follow her. I did not say anything. I just kept shopping. A few weeks after that, I saw a moving truck outside her house. Marcus texted me a photo of the truck with the caption, "She is really leaving." I replied, "Good." That night, I sat on my back deck and looked at my fence. It was still perfect. I thought about everything that had happened, and I realized something. Kathleen had spent months trying to make my life miserable over a fence. And in the end, she had lost everything. Her position, her credibility, her home. I had spent the same months building a case, keeping receipts, and staying calm. And I had won. Not because I was louder or meaner, but because I had proof. That was the lesson. In HOA disputes, the person with the best evidence wins. Always. The HOA held an election 3 months later, and a new board was voted in. The new president sent out a welcome letter promising transparency, fairness, and respect for homeowner rights. The letter included a direct apology to me for the harassment I had endured. I framed it and hung it in my office. Rick called me a few weeks later and asked if I needed any more work done. I said, "Not right now, but I will keep you on speed dial." He laughed and said, "You are the calmest client I have ever had during an HOA war." I said, "I had good evidence and a good lawyer." He said, "And you did not let her get in your head. That is the real win." We hung up, and I sat back in my chair. He was right. Kathleen had tried to break me, and she had failed. The fence was still standing. I was still here, and she was gone. Glad you could make it to the end.